线长山又高，处处港口都险要。
With the exception of more hardline Taiwan separatists, very few people would deny that Taiwan's culture, at its very core, is Chinese, even if they view Taiwan as a separate country from China. Prior to the turn of the century, the vast majority of the people in Taiwan self-identified as Chinese, and between the 1940s and 1990s, the official ideology in Taiwan taught us to strive to be upright and honorable Chinese people. Classrooms would have slogans on the walls like 做个活活泼泼的好学生，做个堂堂正正的中国人, which means be a bright and active student, be an upright and proper Chinese. Why then did so many people in Taiwan go from identifying as Chinese to rejecting a Chinese identity in such a short period of time, despite living in a Chinese society, speaking Chinese languages like Standard Mandarin, Hokkien, and Hakka, practicing Chinese customs, and eating Chinese food? What have I told you? The Chinese identity in Taiwan was never as strong as it seemed. Before we continue, I want to take a brief moment to thank all of my supporters and patrons. Each share and like helps the show grow, and as an independent content creator, every penny contributed to the show helps keep this labor of love sustainable. It is each and every one of you that keeps this show running. As always, here's a quick shout out to my upper level patrons: Alvin Zhao, Wang Yijing, Michael Kim, Victor, CD14039, Jim Fox, Kabasada Fogo, SCY, Maddie Roxy, Thomas Siegel, Zhang Wei Wei, Dolores Austin T, and Daniel Sun. Thank you all for going above and beyond with your support. Also, I recently launched a GoFundMe to support the next phase of the show, which is creating documentaries and vlogs that tell stories about China, past and present, Taiwan and the mainland, on location. The funds will go towards equipment and an initial fund to make these on-location projects possible. If you'd like to help bring this vision to life, check out the link in the show notes for more information. So, why do I say Chinese identity in Taiwan was always weak, even though the ancestors of today's population were the very people who brought Chinese culture over from the mainland centuries ago? The thing is, and I touched on this a few episodes ago when I talked about the complicated memory of Japanese occupation in Taiwan. Back then, most people identified more with their clans, villages, or home regions than with a broader Chinese identity. They were subjects of the emperor and knew they belonged to a country called China, but their primary loyalty was to their immediate communities. This wouldn't change until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when modern patriotism towards China as a modern state began to rise, represented by movements such as the late Qing reforms, the 1911 revolution, the May 4th movement of 1919, as well as the collective resistance against Japanese imperialism. But even then, this process was gradual and uneven, and began with urban intellectuals before spreading to the rest of the country. And Taiwan was mostly absent from this process. While a modern Chinese identity gradually formed on the mainland over these decades, Taiwan had already become a Japanese colony in 1895 and would remain that way until 1945, meaning it was politically separated from the rest of China even if cultural affinities still existed. This is not to say Chinese culture in Taiwan disappeared under Japanese rule. It persisted, but it resembled the Chinese culture of the earlier feudal era, rich in tradition but lacking an emphasis on modern national identity, and very localized. For example, like Hoklo and Hakka wouldn't really identify with one another despite both not only being Chinese but both being Han as well. There were intellectuals in Taiwan who kept up with what was going on the mainland and identified with the modern patriotic movement that was going on over there. But given the circumstances here in Taiwan at the time, their ideas had trouble taking root, and because many of these intellectuals had left-wing and anti-imperial leanings, they were targets of suppression by the Japanese colonial authorities. Then, of course, during the final years of Japanese colonization of Taiwan, there was the Kominka movement that aimed to get the people on Taiwan to abandon their Chinese identity and view themselves as subjects of the Japanese emperor. But this policy was relatively short-lived and therefore could not really take root in any meaningful way, because Japan surrendered in 1945 and sovereignty over Taiwan was transferred back to China. So now Taiwan is back under Chinese rule, the people are just reintegrated with the rest of Chinese society, and that means everything is all good, right? If only history were that simple. Because now you have these people on Taiwan who are Chinese, but had a Chinese identity that was stuck in the feudal era. And you have an incoming Chinese government that was born from the social movements that gave rise to a modern Chinese identity. Whereas the majority of the people in Taiwan spoke Hokkien and a minority spoke Hakka, the mainlanders that came spoke all sorts of different topolecs and dialects, with Standard Mandarin being the official language. Taiwan, having been a Japanese colony, was more economically developed than the rest of China, and with economic developments comes certain cultural shifts. All of these factors led to the 本省人外省人 divide that is glossed over by many Westerners commenting on Taiwan, but is an important puzzle piece for seeing the whole picture. For new viewers or people who need a quick refresher, 本省人 means people of this province, and it refers to the people on Taiwan whose families had already been established on the island by the time the KMT arrived. The majority of these people have roots in southern Fujian, while some come from the Hakka regions of Guangdong. This term is often incorrectly translated to native Taiwanese, leading people to think that Taiwan was majority indigenous before the KMT arrived, but that's not the case at all. In fact, by the time the Japanese arrived in 1895, Taiwan already had a majority Han population. And then there's 外省人, which refers to people whose families arrived to Taiwan from the mainland after Taiwan's return to the ROC in 1945, with most of them arriving in 1949 and some in the years following that. People seem to forget this, but from 1945 until 1949, Taiwan and the mainland were governed by a single central government. But it was a very chaotic time on both sides of the Taiwan-Strait. On the mainland, the Chinese Civil War was resuming, and in Taiwan, tensions were brewing. A lot of existing civil servants were fired and replaced with less qualified mainlanders for the simple reason that the existing civil servants, educated under Japanese rule, did not yet learn to speak Standard Mandarin or write formal Chinese proficiently. From an administrative standpoint, there were valid and pragmatic reasons for doing this, but if you were a 本省人 stuck in that situation, how would that have made you feel? Once again, you have these new rulers from outside of Taiwan and from very far away speaking a different language or topolek than what you spoke at home. And these newcomers ran the system you were under. During the end of Japanese colonization, you look forward to being reunited with your fellow countrymen, but what you ended up with was a new out-of-touch authority that made you feel like a second-class citizen in your own home, with a bunch of undisciplined soldiers roaming the streets that did not seem to understand how a modern society worked. I'll give an example. There were stories of soldiers from the mainland that arrived in Taiwan to oversee the transfer of Taiwan from Japanese to Chinese rule. But these soldiers were from rural areas on the mainland, and they had never seen elevators before. There were also stories of a mainland soldier buying a water faucet from a hardware store, sticking it on his wall, then going back to the hardware store to complain that water didn't magically come out, not realizing connecting it to water pipes was part of the equation. So what about the quality of life? Before 1945, you lived under a war economy, and you hoped that the end of war meant rebuilding the economy and society. But because the Civil War was resuming on the mainland, you were heavily taxed so the KMT could fight communists on the other side of the Taiwan-Strait. Inflation was out of control, and apart from not being bombed by the US anymore, your standard of living wasn't much better than the final years of Japanese rule. If you were a commoner, you'd probably just grit your teeth and accept this as fate while not exactly being a fan of the KMT. If you were part of the local aristocracy that enjoyed certain privileges under Japanese rule, you probably missed the so-called good old days. And if you were an intellectual, chances are you'd sympathize with the communists on the mainland and oppose the KMT for its incompetence. If you were part of the aristocracy that enjoyed certain privileges under Japanese rule, you'd oppose the KMT as well, but for different reasons. And if you were a part of the lumpen proletariat that got drafted into the war on the Japanese side and returned to Taiwan unemployed and saw a bunch of KMT officials from the mainland mismanaging Taiwan, your resentment would probably be aimed towards mainlanders or 外省人 in general. Notice how among all of these various tendencies, there was one overarching theme. You either actively opposed or at the very least didn't really like the KMT. Of all of these trends, commoners going with the flow but not really liking the KMT, the local aristocracy hating the KMT and missing the Japanese, or the lumpen proletariat blaming their problems on mainlanders, and intellectuals that sympathize with the communists and oppose the KMT. Only the last one represented a homegrown movement opposed to both Japanese imperialism as well as KMT corruption, and also felt patriotic towards China in a modern sense. But because they were either communists or fellow travelers, they were cracked down on by the KMT hard, especially after the 228 incident. I won't go too much into detail into the 228 incident today because I already did that in a previous episode, which I highly recommend you watch because every year on February 28th, a bunch of Westerners, both pro and anti-China, will talk about the 228 incident and get practically everything wrong. But what I will say about the 228 incident is, you'll notice that among the demands raised by the initial wave of protesters after Ling Jiangmai's incident with the police, most of them had to do with letting the people of Taiwan into the provincial government and to let the provincial government of Taiwan operate with a high degree of autonomy from the central government in Nanjing. But the problem was, the lumpen proletariat violence that raged during the 228 incident led to a violent military crackdown by the KMT, and many of these intellectuals who called for reform were blamed for inciting the violence, with many of them locked up, disappeared, executed, or driven into exile. So, if you were one of those intellectuals at the time, would it be unreasonable to start questioning whether or not you were truly Chinese? Because the Chinese government at the time, which was the KMT, certainly did not make you feel like your voice mattered. And then just 2 years later, in 1949, the KMT lost control of the mainland, and instead of the Taiwan provincial government operating with a high degree of autonomy from the central government, now the entire central government relocated to tiny little Taiwan. Now, of course, the PRC was established on the mainland, but if you lived in Taiwan, the Chinese government you directly dealt with at the time was not the one in Beijing, but the one that relocated from Nanjing to Taipei. The National Assembly for this government was elected in 1948 on the mainland and was meant to represent the entirety of China. So needless to say, the majority of this National Assembly was made up of people from the Chinese mainland and not from Taiwan. Taiwan had representation in this National Assembly, but Taiwan made up just 0.03% of China's territory and only a small part of the population. So the seats held by representatives of Taiwan were quite negligible. As you know, Taiwan entered a state of martial law and democracy was suspended, meaning the National Assembly was never re-elected and new representatives only joined to replace the ones that died. So because democracy was suspended, that meant the highest levels of central power were concentrated in the hands of these elites from the mainland, while Taiwan's elites would mostly be relegated to city and county governments until later on during the Jiang Jingguo era when he began appointing locals from Taiwan to higher positions of power. Because nearly everyone higher up in power was from the mainland and identified strongly with being Chinese, and because the education system, media, press, and all that would promote this identity, that meant a modern Chinese identity could finally take hold in Taiwan, right? Yes. That did happen, but there was just one problem. The patriotism the KMT promoted was for a China that no longer existed in the real world and only existed in the minds of the mainland elites in Taiwan, while everyone actually living on the Chinese mainland was moving on from the past and creating a new future under the leadership of the Communist Party. So getting locals in Taiwan on board with this brand of Chinese patriotism was like trying to get outdated software to run on barely compatible hardware. You can do it, but the code will probably break at some point. A huge part of this education in Chinese patriotism carried out by the KMT was instilling this sort of longing for the mainland. And this works on people who have mothers or fathers from the mainland, who grew up hearing stories about what life was like over there, But if you were a 本省人 who's 6 or 7 generations removed from the mainland, it'll feel very distant. I'll use myself as an example. My paternal grandfather was from Shandong province, so I grew up hearing a bunch of stories about his life through my dad, about life in Shandong, becoming a child laborer, going to China's northeast as a migrant worker before going to Korea. So because in my mind, Shandong is an important part of my heritage and who I am, I inherently have a more emotional connection with the Chinese mainland. My mom, on the other hand, is 6 generations removed from southern Fujian. She did not grow up hearing elders talking about life on the mainland because nobody who was alive by the time she was born was ever there. So I don't think songs about longing to go back to the mainland and to see the Yellow River and Mount Tai resonate with someone like her as much as they might resonate with me. In Taiwan today, only about 10 to 15% of the population are 外省人, people whose families arrived in the years following World War II. The remaining 85 to 90% of the population has been in Taiwan for centuries, or longer if they're part of the 2% indigenous population. So for the majority of the population, a patriotism and Chinese identity built on longing for the mainland just isn't very effective. And for 外省人, the 3rd and 4th generations have been in Taiwan long enough at this point that Taiwan is just simply objectively their home. Not to mention, the line between 本省人 and 外省人 is extremely blurred now because of a bunch of intermarriages. So at this point, many 本省人 have 外省人 cousins, and nearly all 外省人 have 本省人 relatives, or at least one 本省人parent or grandparent. I think it's obvious that what I'm saying is the Chinese identity that the KMT tried to enforce in Taiwan was quite fragile. And because it's fragile, ideas like Taiwan separatism, which were once fringe, could eventually erode feelings of Chinese identity for a large part of the population, which is exactly what happened. But the question is why? Of course, we can get into how the US reluctantly supported Chiang Kai-shek to ensure Taiwan stayed out of the control of the communists and how they wanted him to declare independence or at least 2 Chinas to formalize the split, and how because he refused, the US allowed separatist forces to grow so they could use them as controlled opposition against Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT to keep his government in check. But this strategy wouldn't have worked if separatist forces did not exist in Taiwan. And it's not really because there's that many people that have positive feelings towards Japan and wish for the good old days of colonialism. Those people are kind of fringe too. Remember how after 1945, everyone higher up in power was from the mainland while local aristocrats that were once powerful under Japanese rule were relegated to city and county governments? This means we have a situation where the 本省人 elites are trying to gain more political capital under a system that's governed by 外省人 elites. While 外省人 elites had considerable political power, 本省人 elites had one advantage. Taiwan was their home, and the vast majority of the population was 本省人. And because the Chinese patriotism promoted by the KMT was very centered around 外省人 and out of touch with the realities of Taiwan, the separatist ideology promoted by 本省人 elites eventually had a market among 本省人 commoners once liberalization occurred. But why? Why would a non-elite 本省人 go along with the elites in their bid for power? I think one way to relate this to my Western audience is this. In theory, a working-class black family shouldn't feel like he has much in common with Barack Obama or Kamala Harris, but that doesn't stop the manipulation from happening. And a huge part of the reason why Obama and Harris could posture as people who care about the common black family is because anti-black discrimination exists and black voters hope things can change for the better. And even though most 本省人 and 外省人 are Han, the divide between them was big enough that there was room for this sort of manipulation as well. See, the KMT did tell 本省人 that they're Chinese, but they also enforced policies that made the average 本省人 feel like Taiwan's local identity simply was not being respected and was even being eroded. For example, an effort to get everyone speaking standard Mandarin, laws were passed that banned local dialects from being spoken in schools, and TV and radio had to meet certain Mandarin quota at the expense of local dialects. Of course, in a society where you had 外省人 speaking dozens of dialects from all over mainland China, 本省人 who spoke either Hokkien or Hakka, and indigenous people with their own tribal languages, there was a clear need for a lingua franca. a common language. The KMT's ban on local dialects in schools technically didn't discriminate between 本省人 or 外省人, but if you were a Hoklo 本省人, it felt like a bunch of mainlanders telling you, if you speak your local dialect at school, you'll be reprimanded or fined. Now imagine you're an older rural Hoklo who never had much education. You turn on the TV and everything is in standard Mandarin, and you can't read the subtitles because you're illiterate. In that situation, it feels like the government is saying your language, your way of life doesn't really matter. You're an outsider in your own home. I'm not saying that the KMT was a foreign colonial government like the Taiwan separatists often claim. It was a Chinese government ruling Chinese people on Chinese territory. But it made serious mistakes, and many 本省人 understandably felt like second-class citizens. The KMT said all Chinese, including those in Taiwan, were equal. But in practice, it seemed like some Chinese were more equal than others. Because 本省人 made up the majority of the population, local elites could capitalize on this. They could point out how fragile the Chinese identity promoted by the KMT really was, and then position themselves as defenders of Taiwan's dignity against mainland chauvinism. In doing so, they blurred class contradictions with identity politics, a strategy that helped them win elections. Once again, it's kind of like how Obama and Kamala connected with black voters, or how AOC connects with Latino liberals. Latinx. The dynamic isn't identical, but the playbook of mobilizing identity to gain political legitimacy is quite similar. So why attack Chinese identity if it's already fragile? Because the KMT branded itself as the defender of authentic Chinese culture. The idea that Taiwan was the last stronghold of the so-called Republic of China, the base from which China would someday be restored. To undercut the KMT's legitimacy, their opponents chipped away at that very identity. The message became, who cares about, what the real China is, what is true Chinese culture? You blues, the KMT, are guests in Taiwan, and the reds, the commies, are just like them. They're all mainlanders. Let Taiwan be Taiwan. And this is where I want to push back on the Western pro-China crowd. When you deal with these Taiwan separatists saying, Taiwan thinks it's the real China, Taipei has all of these territorial claims over the mainland, it isn't really the gotcha you think it is. It just shows you're stuck in a Cold War mindset while the local political reality has long moved on. Because these separatists hate the KMT more than you do. The KMT's real failure was not making people in Taiwan feel that their local culture was an integral part of Chinese culture as a whole. They paid lip service to this idea, but didn't back it up in practice. And that gave their opponents plenty of ammo. Over time, this created an environment where an attack on Chineseness was synonymous with an attack on the KMT, and vice versa. So when Taiwan separatists highlight or even exaggerate the brutalities of the White Terror, they're not framing it as a left versus right struggle or, the people versus the elites. They're framing it as Taiwanness versus Chineseness. The logic becomes the KMT did bad things, the KMT was full of mainlanders, and since mainlanders come from the mainland, or as the separatists say, a separate country called China, then China itself must be bad. And this is why when you engage with Taiwan separatists, you shouldn't approach them from a Cold War KMT versus CPC lens or assume their worldview was just recycled Chiang Kai-shek anti-communism, even though traces of that are there. What really drives it is Taiwan's internal identity politics. So how did things end up this way? In the 1990s, Li Teng-hui was both the leader of Taiwan and the chairman of the KMT. Importantly, he was a 本省人, born in Taiwan under Japanese rule. As Taiwan liberalized under his leadership, he began promoting what came to be called a Taiwan-centered consciousness, or 台湾主体意识. There were many reasons for this, but part of it was political. He wanted the people of Taiwan, the majority of whom were 本省人, to see liberalization as a way for 本省人 to become the rulers of Taiwan, rather than having the island governed by mainland-born elites, as had been the case from 1945 until the late 1980s and early 1990s. Li Teng-hui was a complicated figure whose leadership shaped Taiwan's politics and discourse around identity. So I think Li Teng-hui deserves his own episode or even a series. But in short, during the 1990s, he still paid lip service to a broader Chinese identity while simultaneously promoting Taiwan-centered consciousness among the population. It wasn't until after he left office in 2000 that he openly supported Taiwan separatism. Relations between 本省人 and 外省人 had been rocky in Taiwan since the 1940s, and the KMT was historically associated with the mainland-born elites who were a minority in Taiwan. But in the era of democratization, this posed a real political challenge. Promoting a shared local identity was one way to bridge that divide. It framed Taiwan as a home for everyone, regardless of provincial origin, and emphasized that people on the island would live together for generations to come, so we're all Taiwanese. Because Li Teng-hui himself was a 本省人, this initiative was seen by the 本省人 majority as empowering their group, which had historically felt marginalized in politics. At the same time, it made the idea that 外省人 were also Taiwanese more mainstream, allowing them to feel included in a society that was about to become more, where 本省人 had more say in things. However, a more cynical interpretation is that this was also an intra-party power strategy. See, the KMT was deeply divided between mainland-born elites who had long dominated the party and government and Taiwan-born members who were gaining influence. By promoting a Taiwan-centered consciousness, Li Teng-hui could rally 本省人 within the party and among the broader population around himself, strengthening his position against the 外省人 dominated factions. This context helps explain why, when Li Teng-hui's administration produced the investigative report on the 228 incident, it's reasonable to suspect that the framing was politically influenced. You know, the report purposely downplayed 本省人 violence against 外省人 and emphasized an exaggerated number of 本省人 killed by KMT forces and presented the tragedy primarily as the senseless killing of 本省人 by 外省人 rather than fully exploring the social contradictions that contributed to it. For more on 228, you can check out the episode I did on it via the link in bio. So after decades of the KMT pushing a top-down version of Chinese patriotism that often left Taiwan's locals feeling like their own culture wasn't respected, followed by the rise of a Taiwan-centered consciousness, it's not surprising that the next phase was the further erosion of an already fragile Chinese identity. And that came in the 2000s when Chen Shui-bian became the first DPP leader of Taiwan. He only won with 39.3% of the vote thanks to a split in the KMT camp, but his victory marked a turning point. When the DPP first emerged, it wasn't known primarily as a separatist party. In fact, it even had a pro-reunification faction. What it was a Big Tent opposition party calling for the end of martial law, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, the basics of a liberal democracy. But once those demands were achieved in the late 80s and early 90s, the party needed a new way to distinguish itself from the KMT, which still carried a strong China-centric identity. The DPP gradually purged its pro-reunification voices, added Taiwan separatism to its platform, and then, when separatism proved too unpopular, they walked it back in favor of promising to maintain the status quo. Still, many inside the party, including Chen Shui-bian himself, remained quietly supportive of separatism, even if they knew it was impossible to achieve. And they realized that while Taiwan separatism wasn't a feasible political goal, the ideology still had its uses. With outright independence off the table, the DPP found another strategy, which was to subtly reshape identity through culture and education to create a new generation of people in Taiwan with the DPP worldview. School curriculums were revised so that Taiwan's history was no longer taught as a part of China's history. Instead, students first learned Taiwan history, then, Chinese history, referring only to the mainland, and finally, world history. Whereas in the past, it was, our country's history, which includes both sides, and then world history. So even though Taiwan separatism wasn't overtly promoted through these shifts, we can see that there is an intentional effort to get a new generation of kids to see Taiwan as something separate from the rest of China. And while Taiwan separatism wasn't overtly preached, schools stopped teaching kids that they're Chinese. At the same time, statues and symbols of Chiang Kai-shek were removed. Officially, this was framed as rejecting authoritarianism, but it also served the purpose of desinicization, since Chiang Kai-shek had promoted a strong Chinese identity in Taiwan and opposed separatism. When the KMT returned to power in 2008, it largely left these curriculum changes intact since the identity issue was so divisive and they did not want to alienate voters. Ma Ying-jeou, who served from 2008 to 2016, tried to strengthen economic ties with the mainland, but the DPP framed him as a puppet of Beijing and warned that economic integration would destroy Taiwan's democracy. So the political framework the DPP pushed regarding themselves in the KMT was, authoritarianism versus democracy, Chineseness versus Taiwanness. And by the mid-2010s, the Taiwan-centered consciousness had become tied to, progressive, liberal, Western-leaning values. And the DPP positioned itself as modern, cosmopolitan, international, and woke, while painting the KMT as backwards, conservative, and bound to a fading Chinese identity. And this strategy succeeded in bringing the DPP back to power in 2016. But without meaningful policy achievements, the party fell back on blaming Taiwan's problems on an imagined version of China that doesn't really actually exist, casting themselves as anti-China freedom fighters defending Taiwan's identity. This narrative peaked in 2019 during the Hong Kong riots. Yet, in the years since, particularly after Lai Ching-te's election and his blatant use of lawfare to isolate political opponents and consolidate power, more and more people have begun to see through the smoke and mirrors. Many are growing wary of identity politics being weaponized at the expense of addressing real social and economic needs. So when you step back and trace Taiwan's trajectory over the past century, what becomes clear is that while Chinese culture and Chinese identity were always present, they were also perpetually fragile, shaped and reshaped by distance from the mainland, colonial legacies, local realities, foreign influence, and internal political maneuvering. And on that note, thank you all for tuning into this episode. If you want more views and insights not typically found in Western mainstream media regarding Taiwan, the rest of China, cross-strait history and relations, and more, follow me on social media. I'm most active on Twitter, but I also do post on Telegram and Instagram, and you can find the links below in the show notes. If you got questions about anything discussed in this episode or anything else, drop a comment on YouTube or send me an email at straighttalk@xiangyu.tw. If you found this episode informative and want to support my work sharing stories and context you won't often hear in mainstream media, sharing with potentially interested friends and subscribing on YouTube or your podcast app, hitting like, dropping comments, all of this helps push this show into more people's algorithms. If you'd like to take it a step further, you can become a channel member on YouTube, support me on Patreon, or make a one-time donation through any of the links in the show notes. Thank you all once again, and I will see you guys in the next episode.